No one is supposed to be able to lose their money, their history, and their state all at once in a single operation. And yet, sometimes, everything goes on as if nothing had happened. When Paul opens his grandfather's tin box, he doesn't find letters, but yellowed Russian bonds. By touching them, he discovers that his family financed a vanished empire. Paul is a wealth manager, name changed for narrative purposes. Usually, he talks about ETFs and life insurance. This time, he's counting the bonds, one by one, on his table. Amounts in gold francs, coupons half torn off. His client only asks him, "Are these still worth anything?" Paul first thought it was a collector's curiosity. Reading the fine print, he understands that these scraps of paper formed an entire system, hidden inside French savings. The system surfaces, without yet allowing itself to be named. On one of the certificates, a printed date jumps out at Paul, 1906. The loan is presented as guaranteed by the Russian state. Under the magnifying glass, he sees the mentions in French, the signatures, the interest rate around 5%, except that these bonds were subscribed to by school teachers, railway workers, small French shopkeepers who had never set foot in St. Petersburg. How could provincial households have ended up financing railways thousands of kilometers away, hardly understanding whom they were lending to? Paul follows the trail of the flows. Every line on the paper points to a mechanism he was never taught, a sharp blind spot in his training. Hypothesis A, reassuring. Paul starts with the simple explanation. He tells himself that these bonds, at the time, were just one exotic investment among others, an opportunity like today's Argentine bonds. Some slightly bolder investors, attracted by a higher rate than that of French consuls, would have put a small part of their money into Russia, an individual, deliberate choice. In this scenario, the Russian bonds would be the mistake of a few gambling savers, poorly advised or poorly informed, who had voluntarily taken on more risk to scrape a few extra points of return. Paul imagines cautious bankers warning their clients, "It's far away, it's political, don't put everything in there." Isolated decisions, individual consequences, nothing systemic. This hypothesis collapses when Paul comes across figures showing that up to 10 to 15% of French foreign investments were concentrated in Russian securities. The proportion no longer looks like a simple taste for risk. Hypothesis B, complex. Paul then moves up a level. He reads the archives of major deposit banks, dissects reports from Crédit Lyonnais, Société Générale, and Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas. He forms another idea. This is no longer a matter of daring individuals, but of sophisticated financial engineering. Banking syndicates would have structured Russian issues like well-oiled machines, bonds in gold francs, coupons easy to cash, staggered payments, polished advertising in Le Figaro or Le Petit Journal. The Russian state, industrially backward, needed capital for its railways, its army, its factories. French banks would have acted as a bridge, collecting their fees, spreading the risk across thousands of portfolios. In Paul's mind, a diagram takes shape. At the top, the imperial treasury in St. Petersburg. In the middle, French ministries quietly encouraging the export of capital to the Russian ally. At the bottom, the small investors. A technical system, certainly massive, but guided by economic logic. France has too much savings, Russia not enough capital, the banks optimize and cash in. Then Paul reads diplomatic correspondence explicitly mentioning the use of the loans as an instrument to consolidate the Franco-Russian military alliance, and his diagram flips. It was not finance serving the alliance, it was the alliance that instrumentalized savings. Hypothesis C, disturbing. Paul comes to a darker idea. What if these certificates, so neatly packaged, had mainly served to transfer, silently, Russian political risk into French living rooms and kitchens, under the cover of patriotism and bourgeois respectability? And what if small savers had been the invisible counterparty to a diplomacy that would not assume its geopolitical bets on its own deposit? The reversal. From then on, Paul no longer looks at the bonds as errors or accidents. They look like pieces of a carefully maintained apparatus. On each bond, he no longer sees just an interest rate, but a question. Who knew what, and when? The question hangs in the air, without an immediate answer. Paul has to understand how this arrangement could hold together, when everything indicated that the Russian Empire was standing on shifting ground. He goes back to the beginning, but without telling the story like a textbook. He follows it through what happens to money. In France, after the defeat by Germany and the payment of the colossal indemnity, savings are rebuilt surprisingly fast. In the Crédit Lyonnais ledgers, Paul sees thousands of small accounts appear, portfolios full of bonds. A rentier bourgeoisie takes shape. Civil servants, widows, notaries, people looking for regular income. Interest rates in France are low. Government annuities are no longer enough. Households want good 4%, solid 5%. On the other side, the Russian Empire is driving its heavy industrialization. Figures drawn from Witt's work show a massive lag compared to Western Europe. To catch up, it needs rails, locomotives, factories, a modern army. All that is expensive. Too expensive to be financed solely by domestic taxation. So the empire turns to foreign countries. Paul sees the French ministries appear in the picture, but not as guarantors, rather as organizers. At the Quai d'Orsay and the Ministry of Finance, civil servants closely monitor capital flows going to Russia. Diplomatic archives refer to the investment policy for French capital. The military alliance is taking shape. Official visits, conventions, cruises of friendly fleets. Behind the scenes, the loans become a tool. Sending money to Russia means strengthening a future ally against Germany. The wall. Paul touches it when he comes across period advertisements. Large posters, ads in the national and regional press promoting Russian loans. Attractive yields, reassuring wording. The argument of the alliance. A saver who reads Le Temps and listens to his banker does not see a risky bet on a distant regime. He almost sees an extension of the French state. A serious, legitimate gesture, almost patriotic. Yet warning signs exist. Russia is experiencing budgetary strains, difficulties after the Russo-Japanese War, the 1905 revolution, strikes, the Duma, all that is widely discussed. Political risks are not invisible, just absorbed into the narrative. They are temporary disturbances, a step toward modernization, and the issues continue. 1906, yet another large loan, intended to rebuild, stabilize, reassure. Paul looks for the single reason that allowed this system to hold together despite everything. Not a multiple conspiracy, a single force. He finally sees it in parliamentary archives and regulatory texts, the deliberate absence of explicit guarantee. The French state lets it happen. It never officially guarantees the Russian loans. Nowhere does it write that it will cover the losses. At the same time, it lets the subscription campaigns unfold. It readily admits the securities to the official listing. It opens to them bank counters, notaries networks, savings banks. The banks collect placement fees. Intermediaries get their commissions. Russia receives its capital. No one signs any clear legal commitment to bondholders. Everyone implies, through the alliance, through the setting, through the continuity of issues, that these are investments considered respectable. This legal void becomes the wall. When, later, the Soviet default comes, it is against this wall that French investors will come to be dashed. No written guarantee, but a bundle of moral, political, symbolic clues, which in turn are worth nothing before a judge. Paul thinks of that physical detail that stays in his mind, the trembling fingers of an elderly client who came to show him her plastic laminated Russian bonds, the stiff edges almost cutting the skin as she squeezes them. She has kept these papers the way one keeps a tacit contract with the state and the bank. What she holds is not just foreign paper. It is the material trace of a promise never formulated, therefore never broken legally, but shattered in every other respect. The client's gesture keeps coming back to him as he leafs through the archives. When Paul talks with financial historians, the consensus comes down to one sentence. France massively financed Imperial Russia with household savings, in a movement judged rational given the expected returns. Another one tells him that the real debate is less about the Soviet default than about the responsibility of the banks and the French state and how the risk was presented. Some studies showing important nuances between what financial actors knew and what subscribers understood. But in front of the microphone, they all seem to refuse to take an idea to its conclusion, to acknowledge that the political use of loans as an alliance cement may have rested on the implicit acceptance that, if everything went wrong, It would not be the states that paid, but the small investors. The unspoken moves around, without ever settling into a sentence. To answer his client's question, Paul has to follow the bonds beyond the fall of the Tsar. War breaks out. France launches its own national loans, mobilizes its savings for its cannons, its trenches. Private capital flowing abroad contracts, but the Russian securities already issued remain in drawers, and for a time continue to pay coupons. Russia, meanwhile, is sinking. It borrows directly from France and the United Kingdom for its war effort, accumulating a heavy foreign debt. Revolutions break out. In February, the Tsar abdicates. The provisional government, for a time, continues to service the debt. Coupons are still arriving at some French branches. Then comes October. The Bolsheviks seize power. A few months later, a decree announces the repudiation of all Tsarist and provisional debts. For French bondholders, everything stops dead. No more coupons, no more amortization. On the Paris Stock Exchange, the prices of Russian securities collapse. Some bonds become almost unsellable, classified as in distress. Yet the French state does not place itself between its savers and Soviet Russia. It breaks off diplomatic relations, refuses to recognize the repudiation as legitimate, but does not create any general compensation mechanism. The bondholders find themselves caught in a vice between a Russia that no longer wants to pay and a France that refuses to assume responsibility. In the interwar period, Paul sees a strange scene take shape. In Parliament, elected officials question ministers. They recall how French diplomacy promoted the alliance, how Russian issues were presented in the press. Some accuse governments of having allowed people to believe in a kind of implicit safety. The ministers respond by brandishing the legal texts. No legal guarantee had been given. The investments were private. Everyone had to be aware of the risk. Meanwhile, bondholder associations organize. Unions and committees list the securities, file petitions, calculate the amounts lost. Parliamentary investigative commissions look into the issue and publish detailed reports. The banks, for their part, are criticized for the fees they pocketed and their overly reassuring prospectuses. Certain newspapers are blamed for favorable articles written in a context of advertising revenue tied to Russian loans. But the wall remains. No massive buyback mechanism, no systematic conversion by the French treasury. The question of Russian debts becomes a permanent political dispute with Moscow, a weight in every diplomatic negotiation, without ever turning into clear compensation for bondholders. In the 1930s, the global crisis makes markets even more fragile. Paradoxically, some circles in France see the USSR as an economic partner not to be neglected. Discussions open on a partial settlement, on compensation for nationalized property. But political instability, the crisis, and then the Second World War suspend everything. The Russian loans file is literally frozen. Only later, in the second half of the 20th century, does the machinery slowly start up again. Paul discovers indemnification agreements concluded between states, lump sums paid by Moscow to Paris to settle old claims in a global manner. The French state sets up commissions, registers bondholders, checks the authenticity of the bonds, classifies the securities by category. Scales are fixed. The compensation payments are real, but far below the face value of the bonds, not to mention the interest lost over decades. The money paid by the USSR, then by the Russian Federation, is redistributed by the Treasury, sometimes supplemented by the French budget. At the end of the process, many bondholders, or their heirs, receive sums considered symbolic compared to the losses suffered. For Paul, the shock is not only financial. What collapses is not just the value of a few old papers. It is a stubborn belief. The idea that when the state allows national savings to be tied to a strategic ally, it will always end up standing behind its citizens if everything falls apart. By following the chain to the end, Paul sees a different picture. French savings financed the industrialization, the railroads, the army of a foreign empire. French banks took their profits along the way. The diplomatic alliance had found a powerful instrument in it. When the regime fell and the debt was repudiated, the risk was left, for the most part, on the shoulders of the holders. Decades later, the state partially compensated in its own way, handling the exit as an administrative dispute to be settled, not as a moral promise to be honored. So when his client asks him again, "Is it still worth anything?" Paul answers with numbers, tables, laws. But another question, which he keeps to himself, haunts him. How many current systems still rest on the idea that if everything collapses, it will never be the state that pays, but, once again, the ordinary saver? The question finds no clear closure in his mind. The tin box has been left open on the desk. The Russian bonds are spread out, their stiff edges bending slightly under the yellow light of the lamp. At the bottom, an old yellowed newspaper shows a subscription advertisement with a double-headed eagle and promises of stable income. Paul's hand, as he closes the box, lingers on a detached coupon, still unperforated.